Yesterday, at 3:32 p.m., reports began circulating across multiple intelligence channels that North Korea's multi-billion-dollar defense partnership with Russia had collapsed. What was once presented as a cornerstone of Moscow's wartime resilience has now become a symbol of failure, mismanagement, and geopolitical overreach. The $15.6 billion military contract, signed under the guise of strategic cooperation, has ended in complete ruins, marking one of the most significant breakdowns in modern wartime alliances between authoritarian states. This contract, forged in secrecy between Pyongyang and Moscow in the latter half of 2024, was designed to bolster Russia's depleting weapons stockpile during its prolonged conflict with Ukraine. North Korea had agreed to supply Moscow with large quantities of artillery shells, ballistic missiles, and short-range rocket systems. Much of this inventory was derived from outdated Soviet-era blueprints, but reportedly re-engineered to meet contemporary combat demands. In return, Russia promised North Korea advanced satellite technology, energy assistance, and partial access to defense technologies intended to modernize Kim Jong-un's domestic arms industry. However, as the clock ticked toward evening, around 6 p.m., global defense analysts confirmed what many had already suspected. The partnership had imploded from within. The primary cause of the collapse appears to be the catastrophic failure of the supplied munitions. Ukrainian drone footage and intercepted Russian communications revealed that a significant portion of North Korean artillery shells malfunctioned, misfired, or detonated prematurely. These failures not only endangered Russian troops, but also swiftly eroded what little trust remained between Moscow and Pyongyang. Field reports later confirmed that out of the total weapons pledged, less than 60% were ever delivered. And of those, almost half were deemed operationally unreliable or unfit for modern warfare. The collapse of this contract underscores a deeper truth about Russia's ongoing military struggles. Facing mounting sanctions, supply chain breakdowns, and dwindling domestic production capacity, the Kremlin turned increasingly to its limited pool of allies, namely North Korea, Iran, and China, for military and economic lifelines. Yet, as Ukraine's resilience and technological innovation intensified through 2025, each of these alliances began to fracture. North Korea's failure represents perhaps the most dramatic example yet of how this reliance on external partners has backfired. Compounding the poor quality of the weapons, Ukrainian operations played a critical role in derailing the logistics network. By 4 p.m., intelligence reports began detailing how Ukrainian cyber units and reconnaissance teams had tracked and intercepted shipments moving through the Russian Far East. Several of these consignments were traced to the port of Vladivostok and then toward Belgorod and Kursk, regions frequently targeted by Ukrainian long-range precision strikes. Analysts believe that Ukrainian sabotage operations and sanctions-driven logistical disruptions were critical. One particularly striking revelation came from a leaked European satellite report, suggesting that nearly 40% of North Korean armaments destined for Russia were destroyed in transit before even crossing into active combat zones. Later, around 9 p.m., Ukrainian intelligence operatives released a detailed briefing highlighting how their strikes on Russian depots, specifically in Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk, had destroyed several batches of North Korean shells. These operations were reportedly guided by satellite imagery and electronic intercepts that tracked cargo movements from the port of Rajin in North Korea. Evidence suggested a meticulously coordinated campaign by Ukraine and its Western allies, demonstrating that the deal had been under surveillance for months. These losses proved catastrophic not only for Moscow's wartime operations, but also for North Korea's own ambitions. Kim Jong-un's regime had viewed the $15.6 billion deal as a financial and strategic opportunity to reassert global relevance and secure leverage against international sanctions. The contract promised vital cash inflows, estimated by European defense intelligence to be equivalent to nearly $6 billion in payments, partly in cryptocurrency and partly through oil and raw material credits. Instead of elevating Pyongyang's standing, the failed venture has exposed the regime's technological weaknesses and limited industrial capacity. By 7 p.m., both Western and Asian media outlets began reporting on the collapse. South Korean intelligence sources confirmed that Kim had recalled several of his top defense officials for internal investigation. Early signs suggest that Pyongyang may be preparing to scapegoat mid-level officials in the Ministry of Munitions industry for the debacle. Reports emerging from the capital described a sudden tightening of internal communications, with officials ordered not to discuss the deal. Satellite imagery even showed increased activity near several military facilities, likely connected to these investigations. For Kim Jong-un, this debacle represented not just an economic setback, but a severe political one, as the regime had heavily publicized its growing ties with Russia as proof of breaking diplomatic isolation. Economically, the consequences were severe. North Korea had redirected vast industrial capacity toward this deal, diverting resources, energy, and raw materials away from domestic production. Factories in key military-industrial zones had been operating around the clock. With the collapse of the contract, these factories now face shortages, and the sudden disappearance of projected revenue is catastrophic for a regime already struggling. There were even unconfirmed rumors of purges targeting logistics officials accused of sabotage and negligence. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the situation was equally dire, and the state's propaganda machinery struggled to contain the fallout. Russian state media maintained silence, avoiding mention of the contract altogether, while internal Kremlin briefings reportedly classified the failure as a strategic embarrassment. The timing could not be worse for Moscow. As Ukraine's counteroffensive operations intensify, Russia finds itself increasingly isolated. Leaked internal memos from the Russian Ministry of Defense suggested growing frustration, questioning why Moscow had invested so heavily in unreliable foreign contracts. This internal dissent reflects the growing realization that Russia's wartime economy is under unsustainable strain. As its ammunition reserves continued to deplete, the Kremlin was left scrambling to find alternative suppliers. Iran's support, though significant, was proving insufficient, and China, wary of secondary sanctions, had quietly scaled back covert assistance. North Korea had been the third pillar in Moscow's supply triangle, and now that pillar had crumbled. Further evidence emerged around 9:15 p.m., suggesting the contract's breakdown was mutual. Russian defense agencies allegedly withheld certain payments and technology transfers due to the poor performance of North Korean systems in combat. This breach of trust effectively dismantled the cooperative framework. Sources from within the Russian Defense Ministry, cited anonymously by investigative journalists, described the episode as a high-cost failure with zero strategic return. Intelligence briefings from Tokyo and Seoul indicated that Russian officials had quietly cancelled several joint meetings planned for later in the year, including one to finalize technology transfers for satellite guidance systems. Around 9:30 p.m., Ukrainian defense officials issued a statement indirectly referencing the collapse, noting that foreign weapon supplies to the aggressor have diminished in both quantity and quality. While not explicitly naming North Korea, the message was clear. Ukraine's intelligence network had successfully disrupted one of Russia's critical supply chains. Analysts within the European Union's Defense Coordination Office confirmed that Ukrainian cyber operations played a decisive role, particularly through targeted disruptions of shipping manifests and digital trade channels. From a broader geopolitical perspective, the breakdown of Kim's deal signals a weakening axis among the authoritarian states supporting Russia. The alliance network that once sought to counterbalance Western influence now finds itself fractured and defensive. North Korea's credibility as an arms supplier has been severely undermined, casting doubt on its future deals. Likewise, Russia's desperation for partners has left it entangled in risky arrangements that rarely deliver meaningful results. At the United Nations, discussions about renewed sanctions against both Russia and North Korea gained momentum. As the night approached 10 p.m., analysts in Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington were already calling the collapse a defining moment. By 10:25 p.m., the story had fully broken across international outlets, confirming that Kim's once celebrated military contract with Moscow had indeed ended in ruins. The reverberations are being felt across Asia and Europe alike, marking not only the downfall of a massive agreement, but the unraveling of one of Russia's last major lifelines in its war effort. As dawn broke after the chaotic night of revelations, diplomats, economists, and defense strategists were aligning on one point. This breakdown symbolized the crumbling of Russia's shadow alliances. In Seoul, officials convened emergency meetings to evaluate security risks, warning that Pyongyang might compensate for the humiliation with provocative weapons tests. Ukraine, on the other hand, capitalized on the moment. President Volodymyr Zelensky released a statement praising Allied unity, noting that the collapse of hostile supply chains proves that tyranny cannot outproduce freedom. Military analysts across NATO emphasized that the fall of the North Korean deal marked a decisive shift in the war's logistical balance, leaving Moscow increasingly dependent on dwindling domestic resources. In Beijing, Chinese officials observed with visible unease. The collapse served as a warning, highlighting how effectively coalition intelligence could neutralize military logistics, further discouraging Beijing from deeper involvement. Ultimately, the fall of Kim's $15.6 billion military contract stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of coercive alliances. Russia's dependence on sanctioned states has transformed from a source of resilience into a liability. North Korea's attempt to profit from conflict has backfired, leaving it weaker and more isolated. And Ukraine, through a combination of intelligence prowess and strategic partnerships, has turned its adversaries' weaknesses into strategic victories.